Moira Dingle stood on the stone step with Cain at her side, the air between them charged with the kind of dread that makes ordinary sounds seem sharp and wrong. They had thought the police visit would be the usual prying questions. A knock and an exchange of polite coldness about the human trafficking inquiry that had shadowed Moira these past few weeks. Instead there was a constable with a camera, another with somber eyes, and a DS Walsh who delivered her news as if she were speaking about the weather, the words neat and clinical and fatal in their intent. 2 bodies were found on your property, she said. Moira's legs nearly went from under her. Cain moved as if a physical force might throw himself into the dirt and drag the truth out from where it was buried. The discovery at Butler's farm hit like a thunderclap. Bodies unearthed from the soil Moira had walked on 1,000 times. One of them, Walsh said, had been identified as Celia Daniels, the same woman Moira had been insisting was out to frame her. The other was Anya, a young woman whose eyes had once been full of fright and quiet hope, one of the victims caught in the net of Celia's vile enterprise. A blanket had been wrapped around Anya's body, and it bore a name tag they'd both seen before Moira's. Cain's face was a hard mask of disbelief. "We didn't do this," he spat, voice low and rough. He wanted to be fierce enough to crack the stone in the ground. He wanted to tear the truth out of the earth with his bare hands. Moira, who had once farmed sheep and bottled milk with the calloused certainty of a woman anchored to her land, found her voice gone. She clung to a truth she believed. Celia had been clever, vicious enough to plant evidence. Celia had motive. Celia had burned away Moira's reputation with whispers and threats long before this. The idea that she had been killed on Moira's land made a grotesque mockery of that history. For all their protests, the arrests were made in front of the children. Belle clung to Caleb, eyes rimmed red, while Kyle stood in the lane like a statue, fists clenched so tight his knuckles showed white. The shepherd moon moved up the sky and watched as officers read rights and snapped handcuffs through a choreography that belonged to a different life. One where neighbors didn't gather on porches to exchange worried glances and whisper theories. Cain was held for a few hours then released. No charge, no stinging cuffs on his wrists, just the bruise of fear on his chest. But Moira's release did not come. DS Walsh's voice had been steady as she read the list of damning threads. The blanket with Moira's name. The DNA found on it. The paperwork planted weeks before that had linked Moira's name to unsavory dealings. The catalog of breadcrumbs that, when strung together, drew a map of guilt pointing directly at her. The Dingle clan, bruised, noisy, unmoored, rallied. Plan after plan was made in the kitchen that had once smelled of stew and clean linen, and was now saturated with tension. Caleb engaged a high-flying solicitor whose smile didn't yet reach his eyes. The solicitor's voice was tidy and expensive, and he promised to do what he could. That promise was the kind of small, brittle thing people seized when the foundations were slipping. But when Caleb returned, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of bad news, and the family realized legal talent could only do so much against paper and soil. Cain felt the room tilt. He remembered the blankets piled high in the guest room, embroidered with names and stained by years, breadcrumbs from children's mishaps, the residue of a life lived hard and true. How could a blanket belong to Moira and yet touch a dead woman's body? How could Celia have been tucked into earth on Moira's land and not been the instrument of a frame? The questions swung in the air, sharp as broken glass. The Dingles' grief became a thing with hands. They moved through their days as if in a fog, slamming doors, bitter words flung like knives, long silences that filled rooms. Yet in the middle of the chaos, Cain found an edge of clarity. They needed proof that someone else had been in Butler's farm that night. They needed a trail that pointed away from Moira, toward the true villain. Cain had never been a man of patient plans. He'd always been immediate, anger and action braided tightly. So he hunted in the way he knew how, knocking on doors, prodding at neighbors, frightening cattlemen into awkward confessions, gathering every scrap that might become a thread. At the police station, Moira was a study in fracture. Question after question bit into her. She told the story of threats and slanders, and how Celia had set her up years before. She told how she'd argued with the woman, how she'd been threatened with exposure, how she'd once tried to use her influence to expose the ring. The detective's pen scratched. Walsh's expression was unreadable. Evidence, Walsh kept reminding her, had a way of telling its own story. And this evidence, DNA on a blanket with a name tag, was telling a story that did not bend easily. Outside, the barn at Butler's farm stood empty and frost-bitten, its shadows long. Farmers unloaded hay, neighbors peeked through curtains and gossip as persistent as ivy, began to climb again. Truth in Emmerdale was a living thing and demanded to be fed. Suspicion fed it now, a steady diet of rumor and speculation. An old suspicion had always clung to Moira like damp clothing, the idea that she had something to hide. Whether true or not, people's imaginations had grafted themselves onto that soil with alarming quickness. Cain refused to be paraded into acceptance. He insisted the Dingles fight. Meetings were held in the snug back room of the Woolpack where the light from the bar sockets made the faces of his family look knuckled and earnest. Lisa and Patty argued loudly and then fell silent, the way people in shock sometimes do when their mouths have no words. Belle cried herself hoarse, the sound a dry thing that never quite matched what she felt. Caleb kept talking to his solicitor in halting bursts, clutching papers like talismans. As the case progressed, the prosecuting evidence seemed unstoppable. The planted paperwork, originally placed by Robert Sugden, showed Moira's name linked to financial transfers and odd dealings, proof, if one believed only in documents, that Moira had motive and means. Cain raged at the name of Robert Sugden with a hatred so hot it burned the edges of every conversation. He wanted the man to be dragged into the light and made to explain, to show how easy it had been to shift blame with a pen. He wanted not just justice, but an account of petty cruelties that had fed the blaze. When Moira was formally charged with the murders of Celia and Anya, the chill that fell over Butler's farm felt like frost. The family gathered at the station and Cain watched his wife led away, a moment written in slow motion, the handcuffs catching the cuff of her cardigan, the look in her eyes that was less about fear than astonishment. She pressed fingers to his face, a small, fatal gesture of human love, and then the door closed on a woman facing a future made of iron. The night after the charge, the Dingle kitchen was a war room bathed in the yellow light of the cooker hood. They could either implode or become something else, fighters, conspirators, truth hunters. Caleb's solicitor had a file thick with reports. He had suggestions, plans to appeal DNA evidence, motions to re-examine the chain of custody. There was real work to be done, calls to be made, nails to be pulled loose. They began to reconstruct timelines. Who had been where that night? Who had motive beyond profit? Who had access to the farm? In the center of everything was Celia Daniels, a woman whose power had once been haloed by charm and a dangerous charisma. She had wound herself into the village's underbelly with smooth words and crooked deals. Moira had crossed her. Celia had once smiled at her and then leaned in a little too close and whispered words that tasted like promise and threat. Could Celia have been killed and buried by someone who wanted to sever those threads and leave Moira under suspicion? Or was Celia's real enemy closer than anyone had thought? Caleb's solicitor turned up a sliver of news. Surveillance from a nearby farm had recorded a van on the road the night Celia disappeared. The footage was fuzzy, grainy, the kind of thing that raised more questions than it answered. The van's tires left a pattern in the mud that matched a delivery truck owned by a company with ties to a businessman who'd done deals with Celia in the past. The client's name was a cipher, little more than initials, and a whispered connection to someone with money and a penchant for staying out of view. It was the sort of whisper that hunters and lawyers could turn into a trail. The morning papers seized the story with greedy teeth. Headlines screamed the phrase "murder at Butler's farm," and the village woke to find its private grief on public display. Friends and strangers sent messages, some of support, some of venom. Moira's past life, her mistakes, were spat out in columns that had never seen the kitchen where Belle learned to knead bread, and where Moira once cried into a tea towel when her marriage teetered. The world reduced her down to a single image on a grainy news feed. But the Dingles were not folk given to surrender. They were people who could knit a family back together from frayed string. With Caleb's solicitor pushing, they demanded the original samples be retested. They found small inconsistencies, lab forms with timestamps that looked hurried, a sign-in sheet that had 1 or 2 entries crossed out. Habits of human error in busy institutions had left tiny rooms for doubt. Cain hired an investigator, an old friend who knew the countryside and the way people hid things. He traced phone signals and logged fuel receipts, following a pattern that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Rumors began to shift, subtle as a change in wind. Someone came forward to say they'd seen Robert Sugden near Butler's farm around the time the bodies were believed to have been buried. Another witness remembered a woman in a dark coat arguing with Celia at the edge of the village 2 days before. Each new whisper didn't free Moira, but it widened the map of possibilities. The defense held on to those slivers like miners holding lanterns in a shaft. Inside prison, Moira weathered the days in a way that made Cain ache. He visited when he could, his hands always smelling a little of engine grease and tobacco. The visits were short and tightly regulated. Moira changed in the way people do when their daily rituals are reduced to a schedule. They measured their lives by the distance between visiting times and the hours allowed for exercise. But her eyes held the same stubborn light Cain had loved for 20 years. She was not the same woman who had once raced down to the yard with a tin of paint and a grin. She was thinner around the edges but unbowed. Moira's defense team filed motions, subpoenaed records, and laid traps for inconsistencies. They argued that Celia had enemies aplenty and that the blanket could have been planted. They delved into the forensics chain of custody, challenging each handoff. They pursued the van's registration and traced purchases that led them into an uncomfortable corner of the county, an enclave of men who preferred to keep their business invisible. It was small things at first: an overlooked receipt, a mismatched time stamp, a witness who had been too afraid to speak. Weeks turned into months. The village learned how to live with a headline above the pub. The Dingles learned how to eat dinners in silence and how to breathe when the headaches tightened at the temple. Cain grew quieter, his fury tempered into a hard, focused resolve. He spent long hours at Butler's farm, standing among the furrows as if he could will the truth up from the ground. He spoke to the soil as if to a witness. Old friends brought him leads. A farmhand who'd been paid off to keep quiet, a mechanic who remembered the make of a van, a bartender who had heard a phone call between two men that had made him uneasy. A breakthrough came in the form of a single torn receipt, discovered in a waste bin behind a lorry repair yard. The receipt linked a fuel purchase to a man whose initials matched the cipher the solicitor had found. The fuel had been bought on the night Celia disappeared. The Dingles felt the surge of hope like warmth through an old fracture. It was the sort of paper that could be dismissed in a dumpster. Instead, it was a line thrown across a ravine. When the new evidence was presented, it forced fingers to twitch. DNA re-examination found traces on the blanket that matched a profile linked to a member of Celia's criminal circle, a man who had access to the farm on the night in question. The prosecution's case, which had once felt like a dam around Moira, showed hairline fractures. Celia's van, now traced to that same circle, had tire marks that matched the prints in the field. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to bend the case. The day Moira walked free was a sunrise she and Cain had both imagined. She stepped out under the same sky she'd watched with her children, the air tasting of frost and the soft promise of spring. There was no fanfare, no sudden parade, but the look Cain gave her was one of holy relief. People lined the lane to watch, as if to witness an exorcism of sorts. The Dingles embraced one another in a crush of noise and wet cheeks. Moira's gratitude was a quiet thing. She took each breath as if it were an offering. That was not the end of the story. The legal battles and the whispered suspicions did not evaporate overnight. There were apologies whispered in corners, and there were those who remained unconvinced of Moira's innocence. But there was also a reckoning. The men and women who had fed the trafficking ring were brought to light, their complicity unraveled by the tenacity of those who refused to let the truth be buried. In the weeks that followed, the Dingles repaired what could be mended. Gardens were replanted. The woolpack hummed again with gossip that was gentler than before. Moira and Cain rebuilt a life out of the wreckage, their routines now small acts of defiance against the noise that had tried to swallow them. They learned to trust the land again, planting seeds not only in the soil but in the slow, patient acts of living. Emmerdale had changed as soap stories do. Truth had been stretched and tugged and finally, with effort and a little luck, reknitted. The double murder that had once promised to end a life instead became the wound that taught a village how to care. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.